The studio lights of Jimmy Fallon's show glowed warm and inviting as Tom Felton stepped out to applause, flashing his familiar easy smile. At first, everything felt playful, stories about old auditions, laughter about unexpected fan encounters, and the audience hanging on every word. Felton settled into the chair with practiced ease, joking about how surreal it still felt to walk onto a late-night stage after years of theater work and quieter projects. Jimmy leaned forward, grinning, clearly ready to keep things light and entertaining. They began with nostalgia. Clips rolled on the screen behind them, flashes from Felton's early career that made the crowd cheer. Felton laughed along, nodding, offering self-aware commentary about awkward haircuts and lines he could still recite in his sleep. He spoke warmly about castmates, about growing up in front of cameras, about how fame had arrived before he truly understood what it meant. The audience responded with appreciative laughter, sensing the comfort of a guest who knew how to play along. But as the interview moved forward, the questions subtly shifted. Jimmy's tone stayed casual, but the focus narrowed. He teased Felton about how certain roles refuse to let actors move on, how fans cling to one image even as careers evolve. The joke landed softly at first, drawing chuckles. Felton smiled, nodding, agreeing that it was a strange kind of blessing and burden. Yet there was a pause, a half-second hesitation, that hinted the topic ran deeper than he wanted to explore. Jimmy pressed on, perhaps sensing the tension and mistaking it for comedic opportunity. He asked whether Felton ever felt trapped by expectations, whether audiences truly allowed him to grow beyond the characters that made him famous. The crowd laughed again, but this time the sound felt thinner, more uncertain. Felton shifted in his seat, folding his hands together. His response was measured, thoughtful, but edged with something sharper. He spoke about effort, about years spent proving himself in different mediums, about how difficult it could be to escape a single narrative written by others. His voice remained calm, but the warmth had cooled. The studio seemed quieter, the usual background chatter fading as viewers leaned in. Jimmy nodded, but then added another joke, something about how fans might never forgive him if he abandoned that iconic image entirely. That was the moment the atmosphere changed. Felton's smile didn't return this time. He tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing not in anger, but in concentration. He responded with honesty rather than humor, explaining that actors weren't collectibles frozen in time. He talked about creative exhaustion, about the emotional weight of constantly revisiting the past for the sake of entertainment. The words weren't harsh, but they carried a seriousness that cut through the studio's playful energy. Jimmy attempted to steer things back toward levity, laughing it off and tossing in another quip. But Felton didn't follow. He clarified his point, carefully but firmly, emphasizing that growth should be celebrated, not resisted. The audience sensed the shift and reacted with a mix of applause and uneasy murmurs. Cameras caught crew members exchanging glances, producers leaning forward behind the monitors. As the exchange continued, the balance between host and guest felt off kilter. Jimmy's rapid-fire style met Felton's deliberate responses, and the contrast only heightened the tension. Each attempt at humor seemed to slide past Felton without landing. He wasn't being rude, he was simply no longer playing along. Instead, he spoke with the quiet intensity of someone tired of repeating the same explanations. Felton described moments when interviews felt less like conversations and more like reenactments, the same questions asked in different disguises. He admitted that he sometimes accepted these invitations hoping for something deeper, a chance to discuss current work or personal growth. His words weren't accusatory, but the implication hung in the air. The studio audience grew still, sensing they were witnessing something unscripted. Jimmy tried to pivot again, introducing a prepared segment, but the momentum had shifted too far. Felton gently declined the transition, finishing his thought before yielding the floor. That insistence, polite yet unyielding, was enough to spark a ripple of discomfort. Late-night television thrived on rhythm, on moving smoothly from one beat to the next, and that rhythm had fractured. The lights still shone, the band waited, but the easy flow was gone. Felton leaned back, exhaling slowly, as if realizing only then how exposed he'd become. He offered a small apology to the audience for the seriousness, but not for the message itself. Applause followed, scattered but sincere, filling the space between them. Behind the scenes, producers scrambled, whispering into headsets, deciding how to regain control of the moment. Jimmy smiled professionally, thanking Felton for his honesty, but the tension lingered like static in the air. The interview wasn't over yet, but something had already shifted beyond repair, setting the stage for a conclusion no one had anticipated. The silence that followed felt heavier than any punchline ever could. Jimmy adjusted the cards on his desk, buying himself a few seconds, while Tom Felton sat calmly, hands resting on his knees, his expression composed but resolute. The bandleader glanced over, uncertain whether to fill the gap with music or wait for a cue. The audience sensed it too. This wasn't a rehearsed pause. This was real. Jimmy finally spoke, thanking Tom again and attempting to transition to the next segment. But the usual bounce in his voice was missing. The rhythm of the show had been disrupted, and everyone in the room knew it. Tom nodded politely, but instead of leaning forward to play along, he leaned back, signaling that he had said what he needed to say. The energy between them felt stretched thin, like a cord pulled too far. Producers signaled for a quick break, and the screen briefly cut to applause. As the clapping filled the studio, a staff member approached Tom, speaking quietly but urgently. Viewers at home wouldn't hear the exchange, but the body language was telling. Tom listened, nodded once, and glanced toward Jimmy, not with anger, but with a kind of weary acceptance. Jimmy avoided eye contact, shuffling his papers as if preparing for damage control. When the cameras came back, Jimmy tried to reset the tone. He cracked a light joke, hoping laughter would smooth over the moment, but it landed unevenly. Tom smiled faintly, more out of courtesy than amusement. The disconnect was impossible to ignore. Another producer appeared at the edge of the stage, gesturing subtly, and the decision was made. Jimmy announced that they would be cutting the interview short due to time constraints. The explanation sounded routine, but the audience murmured, unconvinced. Tom stood, straightening his jacket, and thanked the crowd for having him. The applause this time was louder, more supportive, tinged with sympathy. As he turned to shake Jimmy's hand, there was a brief pause, just long enough to register on camera. The handshake was polite, restrained, and final. Tom exited the stage without looking back. The band struck up music too quickly, almost desperately, as if trying to drown out the lingering tension. Jimmy forced a smile and introduced the next segment, but the spark was gone. Viewers could sense it through the screen. Something had gone wrong, and no amount of polish could hide it. Backstage, the atmosphere was tense. Crew members whispered, some defending Tom's honesty, others worrying about the fallout. Tom moved through the corridor quietly, thanking a few staffers who offered supportive nods. He wasn't angry, if anything, he seemed relieved. For once, he hadn't softened his truth to fit the format. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, social media ignited. Clips of the exchange spread rapidly, dissected frame by frame. Some praised Tom for standing his ground, applauding his refusal to be reduced to a single chapter of his life. Others criticized the moment as uncomfortable, questioning whether a late-night comedy show was the right place for such seriousness. The phrase, "kicked off," began trending, fueled by speculation and dramatic headlines. By the next morning, entertainment news outlets had picked up the story. Sources close to the show claimed the decision to end the interview early was mutual. Others hinted at behind-the-scenes frustration, framing it as a clash of expectations rather than personalities. Jimmy's team released a brief statement emphasizing respect and professionalism, carefully avoiding details. Tom, meanwhile, stayed silent for a day. When he finally spoke, it wasn't through a flashy interview or a defensive post. He shared a short message, thanking fans for listening and expressing hope that conversations about growth and creativity could happen in more spaces, not fewer. The tone was calm, reflective, and unmistakably intentional. The incident sparked broader discussion within the industry. Actors and creatives weighed in, some admitting they too felt trapped by narratives that refused to evolve. Others defended the format of late-night television, pointing out its reliance on humor and pace. The debate wasn't about blame anymore, it was about balance. For Jimmy, the show moved on, as it always did. New guests arrived, new jokes were told, but viewers remembered that episode. It lingered as an example of what happens when authenticity collides with entertainment. For Tom, the moment became something unexpected, not a setback but a marker. A line drawn gently yet firmly. Weeks later, when the buzz had faded, the story remained in memory, not as a scandal, but as a reminder that even in spaces built for laughter, truth can surface without warning. And sometimes, being asked to leave the stage is less about being silenced and more about choosing not to perform a version of yourself that no longer fits.